Live from Seville, this is The Twilight Show with Harry Waters, and you are listening live.
Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good day. Hi, hello, how are you? It's nice to see you, hear you, and speak to you all. Thank you so much for coming along today. I hope you're all well. I am a little bit cold, which is not something I often say here in Seville. It's a little bit chilly, which I've been struggling to get used to, but I'll get there. I'll get there. I do have a jacket on and a hat, and I'm sitting inside, so I'm sure I'll get there in the end. I've got a wonderful show lined up for you today with two fantastic guests, one of whom is already sitting in the hot seat, waiting patiently to emerge from the darkness. He says there with a hilarious drop on what we're going to be talking about. But before that, let's have a little update of what's happened in the last week. So in last week's show, we talked to Charlie Jones from Learn Play Nexus, all about his UFIL glue sticks and reusable glue sticks, which something I didn't know existed, but then found out they did, which are fantastic. Saves a lot of single-use plastic. I seem to have turned into some kind of poet today. I didn't realise that was possible. What else have I been up to? Oof, other than trying to stay warm, not a lot. Mostly just working and writing and teaching. And yeah, that's about it really. The daily grind, as I'm sure most of us call it, that we've all become accustomed to over the years of adulthood, which is something I was talking to as well with our guest just before we came on. The issue of becoming an adult, but perhaps not yet growing up, which I'm not sure if it's only me and my lovely guest, but I know that it's a symptom among many of us. So a question to anyone out there, at what point did you think you had grown up? Was it when you became an adult, or are you still waiting to reach the Holy Grail? I think it was a phrase I use quite often, and that is adulting. And, not something that existed many years ago, because I'm pretty sure our parents actually did grow up. Or was that all just a bit of a facade? I'm not sure. But you know what? I'm going to go on the way I am and just continue with life as happy as Larry. I think I reached about the mental age of 14 and then didn't go any further than that. So whether that's a bad thing, I'm not one to say. My wife could probably update you on that. But, there are certain things that I do, but never mind. For example, when I say do, I still laugh at that because it sounds like I'm talking all about poop. But anyway, my guests are waiting in the wings. I will call them in very, very shortly. So hang on to your hats. We'll be back in a couple of moments. But we are going to have a little bit of news, so do hang around. They're coming along very, very soon. So don't go anywhere. It's going to be mega.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Cat Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides, and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out. Visit johncatbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Strike action dominates the news again, with a range of outlets reporting on disputes across England, Wales and Scotland. Whilst the NASUWT union reported 9 out of 10 teachers who voted in a ballot over pay voted in favour of strike action in England and Wales, the union also reported only a 42% turnout. This is below the threshold needed for lawful strike action. The union stated that whilst a strike would now not go ahead, the union remains in formal dispute with the government. The NEU is yet to release the results of its ballot and will also need to reach the 50% member turnout needed for lawful industrial action. In Scotland, the Scottish Secondary Teachers Association has warned of further strike action following walkouts by primary and secondary staff. It says it has no option unless the Scottish Government puts forward a suitable pay offer. The AIS Union and Scottish NASUWT members also aim to continue with strike action until an agreement is reached. Scottish Education Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville maintains that the demand for a 10% pay rise continues to be affordable. Meanwhile, the University and College Union has announced 15 new strike days planned across 150 UK universities in February and March. It has said that a pay offer worth between 4 and 5% made during recent talks is not enough, although the group representing university employers says that the offer is actually worth up to 7%. This comes after the government announced that tuition fees in England will be frozen for another 2 years. Although this is good news for students, the strikes mean more disruption to courses already affected by the pandemic. However, the National Union of Students has been broadly supportive of the industrial action, at least so far. Away from strike action, there have been further stories focusing on what should be taught in schools. This time, the focus is on educating pupils in the dangers of social media in spreading messages that are misogynistic and deeply toxic. The HuffPost website reports on Labour MP Alex Davey-Jones, who called in Parliament for ministers to do more to stamp out Andrew Tate-style misogyny and to stop boys being brainwashed. The MP asked what was being done to tackle radicalisation of young men, but PM Rishi Sunak responded that he was proud that this government launched the world-leading, world-first online safety bill. He also made reference to the autumn statement announcement of £2 billion of extra funding to schools. Although he did not respond with any direct reference to Tate, the online safety bill is expected to complete its final stages in the Commons shortly, before heading to the House of Lords. New figures released recently show that school absences in December were almost double the annual rate, and that this was due to illness. The absence rate, as reported in the Evening Standard, was 14.3% across state schools in the week beginning December the 12th, an increase from 7.8% across the year. The Department for Education in England said the increase was due to a rise in sick days as a result of winter illnesses such as flu, as well as COVID-19 and strep A infections such as scarlet fever. In the Channel Island of Jersey, BBC News reports that the government has brought in 11 UK supply teachers to cover for absent staff. The short-term and long-term measures have been put in place due to staffing shortages, and the supply teachers will cover for up to 2 terms. Short-term housing has been organised for those travelling to the island. The Jersey government said the current vacancy rate for Jersey was 4.3%, but that the long-term plan was to train, recruit, retain and upskill school staff. Finally, the Meanwhile in the Middle East section of the CNN website reports on the United Arab Emirates' plan to become the first Arab nation to teach about the Holocaust in its schools. The move has been praised by some and criticised by others. The nation revealed its plans in a recent tweet and intends to include Holocaust education in both primary and secondary schools. The UAE says it will work with Tel Aviv and Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, to help build the new curriculum. Whilst many see the move as part of the normalisation of relations with Israel, critics suggest that it does not reflect all of those living in the UAE, with many disagreeing with this policy. Full details of the story can be found on the CNN website, with comments on both sides explored in detail. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, let's start the new year with investigating the power of artificial intelligence in education. A lot of people are asking, does your school block ChatGPT? First of all, what is it? Chat Generative Pre-trained Transformer, or GPT for short, is a piece of software designed to mimic talking to a person. The difference is, this person is super clever, and it's been trained by thousands of conversations in the past, and it remembers them all. There are lots of chatbots out there. GPT is popular with young people as the answers it gives are not only correct, but can be slightly different each time, so it's more difficult for a teacher to spot a copy and paste homework. Let's put it to the test with a couple of school questions. I'm using a screen reader to represent ChatGPT to give it a voice. Responses are usually in text and appear as if they're being typed really quickly. I asked, what are the registers in a processor? And I got...
Registers are a type of memory that is built into the central processing unit, CPU, of a computer. They are used to store data and instructions that the CPU needs to access quickly in order to functions. There are different types of registers, each with a specific purpose. For example, the instruction register stores the current instruction that the CPU is executing, while the program counter register stores the address of the next instruction to be executed.
I'll stop GPT there as 3 paragraphs were given in this answer and it's only a 1 or 2 mark question. So I asked, can you tell me in 2 sentences? And I got...
Registers are small, high-speed memory units built into the central processing unit, CPU, of a computer that are used to store data and instructions. They allow the CPU to access and manipulate data and instructions quickly, enabling it to carry out complex tasks at high speeds.
Well, thank you, GPT. That's much more to the point. Powerful, right? How about, can you summarise Of Mice and Men?
Of Mice and Men is a novella by John Steinbeck, published in 1937. It tells the story of George Milton and Lenny Small, 2 displaced migrant ranch workers during the Great Depression in California. Despite their apparent differences, the 2 men are deeply bonded and rely on each other for companionship and support. The novella ends tragically when Lenny, a simple-minded man with a love for soft things, accidentally kills a ranch owner's wife while trying to touch a soft dress, and George is forced to make the difficult decision to euthanize Lenny before he can be punished for the crime.
That's fantastic. However, there's some words in there that are quite big, and my teacher would be quite suspicious that I copied and pasted it. So I'll ask, can you summarise Of Mice and Men simply?
Of Mice and Men is a story about 2 ranch workers, George and Lenny, who are traveling together and looking for work during the Great Depression. Lenny is a large, simple-minded man with a love for soft things, and George is his caretaker and protector. Despite their differences, the 2 men are deeply bonded and rely on each other for companionship and support. However, their relationship is ultimately tested when Lenny accidentally kills a ranch owner's wife, and George is forced to make a difficult decision to protect Lenny from the consequences of his actions.
That's more like it. Now my homework's done, I think I just bought myself some more time on my games console. As always, I'd love to hear what you want to know about tech. Let us know at TT Radio Official. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Thank you very much, Steve. Lots of lovely stuff about AI coming out at the moment. I don't know how I feel about it particularly. I'm not as scared of it as some people seem to be. But also, it hasn't taken my job. So, I'm not that bothered at the moment. I do think it can be a wonderful tool, and I'm sure it will be. Anyway, back to the show. Now, I picked out a few words in the talk there about strike action that struck me as being something that perhaps my students hadn't come across yet. So before I talk more about them, I am going to invite into the studio our guest today. We've got Richard Chin, who is a teacher trainer. He's also an author. And we also have Danny Norrington Davis, who is also a teacher trainer and author. So if I could ask the gents to unmute themselves, that would be lovely. Hi there, Danny.
Hi, Harry. Thank you for inviting us.
You're very welcome. I can see Richard's looking desperately for how to unmute himself. So while he's figuring that out, could you tell me a little something about yourself, how you got to where you are today?
My name's Danny. I'm a teacher trainer and a writer, and I work at International House London. I started teaching 27 years ago. We were talking before the show, Harry, that the plan was I would do my CELTA, my certificate in language teaching, and come out and work in Spain. But that never happened. I ended up pretty much teaching in UK for probably about the last 20 years. So I guess really I am where I am by teaching, training, and sort of being in the classroom and the training room all this time has just given me ideas, and those ideas have been translated into books and the books I've written and things like that. Yeah. Hey, Richard.
Excellent. Richard seems to have figured it out. He's beaten his nemesis. Today it's technology. Tomorrow, who knows what it could be. Richard, so Danny, nutshell summary there of where he is. How did you get to where you are?
Okay, so for me, it's a similar kind of journey to Danny, really. I was originally trained as an actor. I didn't want to be a teacher, but there's not much work for actors, as it turns out. And I did teaching as a stopgap, and a lot of it was improvising, really, because I didn't really know what I was doing at the time. So I did a TEFL course, and then I went off in South America and Central America, and just realised I really liked teaching, and that's kind of what got me interested in taking it up as a career and not wanting to be an actor. But the improvisation bit of it still really interests me, so that's why I stuck with it, and that's kind of how we ended up getting interested, or how I ended up getting interested in emergent language.
It's funny actually that whole improvising thing, because I give a course on lesson planning, which I do think lesson planning is an important part of it. And when you say improvising, a lot of teachers think suddenly that, oh, if you're improvising, that means you're not planning your lessons. Is that the case?
I don't think it is, but you go, Danny.
But no, I don't think it is. I think when I work with teachers now, I very often suggest to them they have space for improvisation in lessons, rather than sort of going in and trying to sort of do a full improv session, as it were. Because I think it won't always fly with the students. Teachers will feel uncomfortable, and the institution you work in might well frown on what you're doing. But I think really when you get students talking, you never really know what they're going to say if you're asking open questions, if you're asking questions you genuinely want the answer to. And that's going to mean that you've got to respond to what they say and how they think and how other people in the room react. So we're always improvising, but I think other teachers don't quite recognise that that's what's happening. They just think they're little side moments of lessons rather than big parts of lessons, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
Well, I think it's a really important point that you can plan a lesson, but there's only so much you can plan it, because you've got human beings in front of you. Things are never going to go exactly how you planned it. Even those lessons that are really slick. And in fact, I kind of worry about the lessons that are planned so tightly that there isn't any room for students to ask questions or for things to come up that you didn't expect.
And yeah, to say that, I'm not saying that every lesson has to be meticulously planned. In fact, that's a lot of time, and it's something that we don't really have. And when it comes to meticulous planning, I'm not sure the last time I meticulously planned a class. There's something a friend of mine refers to as door handle planning, which is as you're opening the door. Now, let's be honest. We've all done that before, and in those situations, perhaps there is a little more improvisation involved. But I think that what you guys are more focused on isn't that whole let's just go and wing it and see how it goes. It is more dealing with what comes up in the lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of emergent language, can you describe what it is?
So emergent language is language that arises in a lesson when we're focused on meaning something, and we didn't plan to teach something, but we teach as it comes up because the students need it in order to communicate. And that can be done with the teacher picking what the learner said, putting it up on the board, perhaps exploring it in terms of its meaning, use, form, pronunciation, and then checking to see if it's what the learner wants to say. So emergent language is different to the typical thing that we're taught on training courses, which is target language, the language that's in the course book, or the language that's in the syllabus that we want the learners to learn, apparently, and take away with them. So that's what emergent language is in our definition.
Yeah, and within that we include sort of different aspects of emergent language. So one is error, dealing with the sort of unexpected errors that come up as students speaking, or difficulties they're having communicating, getting the message across. But there's also little moments in lessons where you think, oh, that's interesting, the student said something interesting, and let's share this with the rest of the group. Or the time the student will say, when they read the text, what does this mean? Or, I didn't understand this bit. So the little moments where students want to talk about an item of language that perhaps isn't part of the plan. I think that can be the trouble with the plan lesson. A student's reading tests and they ask a question, vocab item, and the teacher says, well, don't worry about that at the moment. I've got some language you'll learn. So it's more of an error. It kind of almost comes down to what everyone thinks is interesting at that particular moment.
Okay, now I'm not sure if it's just me, but you seemed to break up in a few moments there. I don't know if it's the Wi-Fi connection or something like that. I did get the gist of it, of what emerged from what you were saying there. It may have just been my end where it was a wee bit patchy. It was jumpy according to Pete as well, who mentioned it in the chat. So I'm not sure if it's the Wi-Fi or the headphones or one of the live radio issues. You see, we're living on the edge here, guys. You know, anything can happen.
I mean, just to follow up from what Danny was saying, then basically, emergent language isn't something weird or different or special actually in a lesson. It's just a normal part of teaching. Students ask us things all the time that we didn't plan for. That is emergent. And it might be a case that the answer you give a learner might be more memorable in that moment because they've asked the question, or they've noticed something in a text, or suddenly everybody's focused on something. I was watching a class recently, and there was a pre-intermediate class. I was watching a CELTA class. So me and Danny do lots of CELTA and Delta and work on MA programs and stuff. And I was watching this class, and it's really interesting. This French guy who, lovely chap, was came up with a phrase. He said, "Oh yeah, there's lots of scammers in Paris." Now the rest of the pre-intermediate class didn't know the word scammer. So they studied with what they wanted to know what it was. And he found it a bit difficult to try and articulate what he meant. And it forced the trainee teacher to then clarify that for the class. So that's an example of emergent language. The student was trying to communicate something and use something. He brought the emergent, this more complex language to the class that then the other students were then exposed to. So it's really our job as teachers to mediate that process between what comes up in a lesson.
I was listening into the radio obviously before, and lots of talk of strike action. I don't want to touch on anything sensitive with you guys in the UK at the moment, because obviously everyone's on strike. I fully support them, but there were lots of things that emerged from that newsreel that I thought. Would this count as emergent language or would it be target language? So obviously in that moment it came up, but if it's from a listening, is it target language or is it emergent language?
I think it depends really. So if you've got, I can't remember the whole recording, but you might have found a recording about strike action and look at maybe planning to or going to. So unions are striking next week. Unions are planning to strike. So you're deciding, okay, we'll listen to this text, answer some questions. Then I'm going to unpack it for the grammar of it. That might be what the teachers plan to do with it. You might ask some follow-up questions about the text. For example, have you ever been on strike? Have you ever been in a demonstration? And a student might say something like, "Oh, in my country, often go on manifestations." That's where you've got this little blur between target language. The topic is striking, demonstrating, things like that. But the language that comes from the student interaction could be anything. So it could be manifestation, meaning demonstration, but it could be tense. It could be a missing, an incorrect collocation. It could just be a student might say something like, "I am a lawyer. We never strike." So the word, the job mispronounced is emergent language. You wouldn't have planned to deal with it. It's something that came up as part of the interaction. So there's very often a blur between the two. But really, the emergent stuff is the unplanned stuff. You don't see it coming, or you only suspect it might appear in the lesson.
Excellent.
I think another example of that as well is as Danny's saying, if you're dealing with, let's say, listening text, and suddenly there's the learner didn't hear something, and maybe it's an issue to do with the connected speech, so it's a decoding issue. So we might stop and we might go back and we might listen to that little segment of text again and again. And that's emergent because you can't necessarily plan that the learners are going to have difficulty with that. It's only maybe in response to the questions that you've given them, even comprehension questions from a book perhaps. Yeah. The emergent bit is the bit that you didn't plan to teach or focus on linguistically.
Now, I know when I started teaching so many moons ago, I remember, doing my course and bits and pieces like this, and always write your vocabulary up on the board. So it would be the vocabulary section up on the board. And as I matured as a teacher, I went further along and I got a bit obsessed with pronunciation, and I learned phonemic script. So what I'd do then I'd write the word up on the board and I'd write it in phonemic script, and then I'd put it on the board, and maybe I'd tell the students to copy it down at the end of class. Maybe I'd just kind of write it on the board and hope it, seeped into their brain through osmosis or something like that. Mostly just wanted to show off that I could write a phonemic script, obviously. But these were the that was it. This is what you do with emergent language. You put it on the board. You maybe write the pronunciation up, and at most, maybe the next class we'd come back and we'd review the new language that had come up in class. But, that was kind of really it. How can we avoid this happening? Because it happens so often, and I don't think that we're really making the most of this emergent language. And as you mentioned before, Richard, this is something that our students are interested in because they've said it. So, they want to know what it means. And often it's far more important, that language that's come up, than, the 10 words that are in the textbook that, you or I or somebody else has written and think are the important words.
I totally agree. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, I think about my board work 10 years ago. What a mess. I mean, I just throw stuff up all over the board. The board would be full, but there wasn't really much organisation to it. So I think that's something I've certainly worked on over the last 10, 15 years. But I think there is a danger that we just throw up a load of language and then, we expect them by osmosis to remember it. And as we all know, learning a language, it takes a lot more work than just seeing something once. It might be memorable because, the student finds that interesting. I mean, I've learned some things in Spanish that, that I've learned, the first time I've heard them because they were interesting and they stuck. And other things I've had to work really hard at learning. So I think as teachers, we do need to provide opportunities to revisit the language and maybe giving the learners some choice over it as well. So one of the things I do is, I have a big column on the side of the board where I put up emergent language. I try not to just put single words. I try to put them in a chunk or look at what collocations go with particular words. So there's a bit of context to it, and write examples up on the board as well. And then at the end of class, I often say to the students, I say 5 minutes. I might say, right, look at the language on the board. Make sure you've got a note of it in your books. Select 5 of the items that you think are useful to you. You go home and learn them tomorrow, and you're going to come back and test each other on it. So a simple idea like that, where you put the learners in charge of what they want to learn, I think is something we can do as well. And then I might, make lexical cards that I bring back into class that got gap fills or jumbles to try and recall some of this high frequency language that they might find useful. Are there any other things you do, Danny?
Yeah, well, I take photos on my board and then create little quizzes or games for. I'm doing one on Friday because it will be the end of the second week with my current group of learners. So I do lots of sort of recycling, but I think it's not all about stepping to the board. So it's a researcher book. Me and Richard have been looking at emergent language for about 10 years now, and we started doing some research with our colleague Nick Andon at King's in 2018. I think we did it, where we looked at different ways that teachers work with emergent language, and sometimes it's by saying things like, "Sorry, what do you mean?" So the learner knows there's a communication gap, and you're encouraging the student to close that gap, work out what they said not being understood by others, or the teacher maybe suspects it not being understood by others. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to turn to the board and deal with it as a sort of artifact, but as an event. Kind of, what do you mean? Or, oh, so you're saying dot, dot, dot. I think we also have recasts, especially with pronunciation. So where I talked about the student who might say, well, I am a lawyer and we're not allowed to strike. You might say, oh, you're a lawyer. Oh, I didn't know you couldn't strike. So you're kind of feeding in the language as you keep the communication going. So yeah, it's a lot of it kind of happens and move by, but it also sort of shows the learners where the gaps are in different ways.
So it's an element of the most complex bit of teaching, which is classroom interaction. So all of the very complex things that are happening between teachers and learners at any moment in the lesson or throughout the lesson. This is something that emergent language is part of.
Now, for me, when I think of and I look at emergent language, now for adult learners and for business lessons especially, I think it's something that teachers really need to pay a lot of attention to. I mean, far too often, a teacher will go into a business lesson with their business book and they'll go in to make sure they can teach the present perfect that day, and then they'll move off. And in terms of like that kind of level and business level, it's the emergent language surely has to be the focus. You have to pay more attention to that because it's relevant to that person's life, that person's job, to that person's well-being.
I think especially in business, it's sort of executive English, there's a lot of one-to-one. And if you spoke to a teacher and said, oh, a teacher in that context, oh, we should work with emergent language, they kind of go, well, yes. I think in that context, it's not an uncontroversial thing because they're often, getting students to do presentations or tell us about your company. And, it's very interactive because there's two people in the room. So the interaction's a little bit easier, I guess. You're not making space for other people. So yeah, I think in those contexts, it's a key part of it. Yeah.
Now, I'd like to look at the complete other end of the spectrum. So we've gone from, we talked very briefly there about the high-end business and how it is very common and to talk about this emergent language in there. What about when it comes to kids? So I have a class of 7 and 8 year olds, and it's quite predictable usually the kind of emergent language that's going to come up. My tooth is wobbling. These kind of things. It's my cousin's birthday party. These are the things that we know are going to come up in class. And when it comes to food, for example, we can predict the different things that are going to come up in class. Do you have any advice for teachers? Because a lot of TEFL teachers kind of have to start really with kids. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I love teaching with kids. I've been teaching for 15 years. I still am. Do you have any advice for teachers going into that situation? There may be new teachers and they've been thrown into a kids class.
I'd just like to preface this with the fact that I haven't taught kids for about 15 years or something, and it's not really my area of speciality. But I have interviewed people who do to find out about what they do with emergent language. And my colleague Katie Kelly, who works in Spain, is a brilliant teacher trainer. We interviewed her for the book, and we talked to her about how do you see it in class. And the thing is with teaching kids, it's interesting that you create space for things that emerge or predicting what might come up. But she said, what often happens in classes is that they're very high structure, and by that I mean there's not much room for wiggle in them. To use the tooth metaphor, but so things are very strict, and it's about classroom management. But the problem is this: the more managed the class is, the less space there is for things to emerge, as you just described. I got actually, it's interesting you asking this question. I got a message from a former Delta trainee from about 4 or 5 years ago. And I interviewed her at the time about what she does, because she was looking into emergent language for one of her Delta projects. And what she used to do in her lessons, at the beginning of all lessons, her and the kids, she had quite young kids that she taught in the Basque Country, I think, or France, can't remember now. And they'd sit round in a circle and they'd just have a little bit of a conversation part of the lesson. The first 10 minutes of the lesson was this. and then things would emerge and she'd teach them as they came up. So I think there is room to work with it with younger learners. Clearly, the colleagues that I've spoken to really think that there is scope for it. But I suppose it's not letting your lessons become absolutely controlled to within an nth of degree of any space to work with what might come up. Because kids want to say things, don't they? Thinking about my
Exactly.
don't shut up. So there's plenty of opportunities to work with stuff that comes up and translate what's coming up as well. That's another thing that can happen in those classes. Anything to add, Danny, to that at all?
Well, we also interviewed a teacher called Yotta for the book who worked with slightly older kids, so sort of heading into kind of 11, 12 years old, and they very often wanted to say things that they wanted to say or how they wanted to say it. So if they have the target language in the book, but they say, oh yeah, but how would I say that to my friend? Or because Yotta spoke the same language, they say, oh, we say this in Greek, but how would you say it in English? And so she'd be sort of updating the language that they were learning from the materials, making it more interesting for them. So younger learners kind of want to say what they want to say very often, and it's kind of I want to say it now. And you can you try and get them to chat about the lesson topic, and they don't, because they talk about what they want to talk about. So you can harness the topics they want to talk about. I think it's every time you get them to write or tell stories too, that's rich in language.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really, really interesting because your learners as a teacher. I think that's what you've got to consider, that the language in the book might not be giving your learners what they want or what they really need. So that's where you come in as the teacher to be able to negotiate that with the learners.
I'm just going to read a comment that Pete's put in here, and it says, I feel like it depends on the approach, though. For example, my partner is an early years teacher who uses a very child-led approach in a free-flow school. So the communication needed is predictable, and learning opportunities emerge from that context. Almost everything emerges as is fed in. Not necessarily the case in EFL or young learner context is taught in. So, yeah, as you're just saying there, it is all about the learners and your context. So, one of the things I've found, so EFL can be very prescribed, because we're trying to get our students to reach a certain level or jump through a certain hoop, or to get a certain they need to get this certificate by this age. So there's a lot of things that have to be taught, which can shackle some teachers. I understand that would be a reason to shackle some teachers. But it is nice when, teachers take those shackles off. And what I like to do with our classes is that emergent language, it does often come from the students. And it isn't just, they want to know how to say tortilla de patatas in English, Spanish omelette. Most of them want to say that because that tends to be what they ate yesterday or they're going to eat tomorrow. But it's in other areas of language that perhaps aren't in course books. How are you? That traditional question that we ask. How are you? Now, my students, the automatic response is either I'm happy or I'm fine. But then there's a couple of them who just get a bit bored of it. And then I don't want to say that. Like, how would I say it in English? And it's like, well, if you were saying it in England, you say, I'm all right. Mm-hmm. So that kind of thing, I think, is very easy for us to kind of slide into the classes. That kind of useful, I'm doing inverted commas here, natural language.
And what starts off as emergent, then in later lessons you come back to and you revisit. It becomes maybe the target language of the future lessons in some weird way. I think it's exactly what you've described is what Katie Kelly described to me about what the classes that she watches and the classes that she teaches. It's working with the younger learners as they want to say these things.
Now, you made a great point, Danny, about older, younger learners, as it were. So, we're looking at our teens and our younger teens up to teens. I think for me, this is like one of the real key areas to emergent language, because these students do want to communicate the way they want to communicate. A lot of these these students now, they go off online and they do gaming online with people, from other countries, and they're speaking English. So this is the kind of language that they want to emerge in the class, so they can kind of make that happen. I was wondering if you had any advice for what we could do as teachers to kind of encourage this emergent language.
When I think it's about, if you are working in a context where there are a few shackles, especially a sort of quite test heavy context, I think what you've got to do is look at the materials you're using and think about how you can exploit them through the types of questions you ask. So of course the students are probably going to have to answer true or false questions or multiple choice questions, but then ask students more open questions as well. So do you agree or disagree with the speaker? How much of this is like your...
You've gone quiet, Danny.
Yeah, sorry, my dad just called despite instructions not to call. He said we were living on the edge. You can hear me, obviously. Where did you get to? Where did I get to?
It was about 12 or 15 seconds ago when you were talking about a way of eliciting students to talk about their ideas. Do they agree or disagree with the speakers? And
yeah, exactly. So it's about kind of moving away from closed questions. So they might have read a text about that they have to answer exam-focused questions on, but then ask something like, what would happen if this speaker lived in your country? Or what advice would you give to them? So you are, even if you cannot kind of change the topic because the topic is set by the book or maybe even set by the institution, you ask them open questions about it. And that's when language emerges. Students have agency to kind of answer the way they want to answer. Because very often the trouble with the materials, it's not just that space for things to emerge. It's the fact that whether you're a 40-year-old student in Brazil or a 15-year-old student in Thailand, you're basically reading the same text and answering the same questions. So, and the answer will be the same for each student. So sometimes it's about changing the task rather than the materials, I think.
Okay, so yes, rather than so we re-guide it so it's into their kind of sphere, and that's really useful actually. It's a great bit of food for thought.
I think the best advice for teachers in terms of emergent language in general is exactly what Danny's saying. It's the kind of questions that we ask students. So not even in interaction as well, not just the ones we give them at the end of a text, for example. So if you ask questions that require real questions that require a real answer that the teacher doesn't know the answer to, rather than these kind of display questions of what's the capital of Peru, Lima. The teacher knows the answer to these. If you ask real meaningful questions, then language will emerge. And as Danny says, the questions that you ask, put some sort of cognitive challenge to the learners. So in that way, you're generating something more meaningful.
So when we're planning our lessons, a great idea to do beforehand, if we're not going to sit down and write our Delta lesson plans for every single lesson, which obviously we're not going to do that. Nobody has, 27 hours a day to do that for every single one of our lessons. But at least, take a glance over the materials and look for some meaningful questions and look deeper into it for something that, we can actually get the students' own opinions from. In that way, we can extrapolate some new language.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't remember which course book it was, but it was one we were using on a teacher training course. And they had a menu in one of the units. And I found it so strange that at no point had the course book writer thought, I'm going to ask the people to decide what they would eat off this menu. So all the questions were things like, how many meat dishes are there? How much is the beef? And I just thought, what would you eat? Could a vegetarian eat here? Would you bring family here? Would this be a restaurant for a party? I think, those kinds of questions so much better, so much more interesting. And the students are processing the text as they would in real life. I know what I'll be writing.
I know what I'll be writing in the next textbook I write.
Yes,
There you
yeah.
go. When I get to the food section, thanks very much, Danny. Got that one sorted. It's a great point though. It's as material writers, it's hard to to know because they are these textbooks that will be going into Thailand and Brazil. So we try and keep it as I don't want to say as simple as possible, but as universal as possible. It's something that we often have to avoid any conflict.
So I can't hear you, Harry.
We can't hear you, Harry. No.
You can hear us.
Right. Ah, you're back, I think. Oh, no, that's me echoing.
No, we can't hear you. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a reason why course books are written in a particular way, and it's obviously to make things, safe to be used in different places and different contexts. But then, what we need to think about in teacher training, then teacher education, is how we train teachers to be able to modify some of that material. One of the ideas behind this is
Yeah.
more complex thought rather than just think about Bloom's taxonomy. So you've got the lower order thinking skills, all the thinking skills are important, but the lower end just understanding something and the different. Remembering something as opposed to maybe analyzing or evaluating or creating. So, if we teach teachers how to make these questions more interesting for students, I think that's probably something we can do to intervene in the gap that we've got.
Yeah. I think so, yeah. I think the other thing about having done some work in Turkey, I recognize the fact that the students are being trained to answer certain types of question because they're in the exam. But I think it's about a sort of a textploitation idea. It's okay, I will use the text and they will answer the questions set by the book, but I'm going to throw in some open questions or evaluative questions or personal response questions. So, Rich, you're right. We train our teachers to think about where they might ask those questions to go with the ones the students are being trained to answer. I think we've lost Harry for a bit. I've got a question from Pete. Dan, what did it say in the teacher's guide? Sometimes it doesn't give you the full story. I have to admit I didn't look at the teacher's guide when I was looking at this lesson. But when the teacher who's teaching the lesson, when we were negotiating, the fact that he decided to ask the question, "What would you eat?" I was kind of yes, that's the thing to do. Yeah.
Because I think it's about authenticity as well of task, isn't it, Danny? What would you really? What are some of the things that you'd really do with these things if you were doing them in real life, and if the classroom is a chance to practice some of these things, then it's bringing those more authentic things that we do with language into class. I know, when I was learning Spanish, not in the classroom, but just communicating with other people. It's very much, I get stuck, and then you ask for a bit of help where necessary. And then a lot of my learnings come through that, through actually just interacting and talking to people.
Gents, can you hear me again?
We can.
Excellent. So, as I said, we're living on the edge here. I have cancelled our Zoom meeting and I've joined on my phone as a guest because obviously something happened in the studio. So we can no longer see each other. I apologise for that. We've had to go old school. It's almost like we're on the phone. Great job there. If you guys are looking for a changing career as not a changing career as an additional career, then Teachers Talk Radios are always looking for hosts. So yeah, very interesting. I interrupted the most interesting part of the whole session as well. That's terrible of me. I should just go and leave you guys to it.
It's okay because the mild panic was setting in over here. So
it's all good. It's a very good point. That thing you mentioned there about the teacher's guide. What did it say in the teacher's guide? Now, as a writer myself, I've recently written a project, and I've written the student pack and the teacher's guide. And when we got the feedback from the pilot, a lot of it was, oh well, the teachers didn't even look at the teacher's guide, which as a writer, you kind of, slump down in your seat and think, oh no. But then as a teacher, you think back and think, how often did I look at the teacher's guide?
Mm.
And I wonder if emergent language is something that could be, overlooked by people because they don't approach their teacher's guides.
I mean, to be honest, I totally agree with you. I can't remember the last time I looked in the teacher's guide. You get so used to the kind of, as Scott Thornbury calls it, a method that is put through the course book. We talk about being post-method, but the course book does carry very often a method to it. It's kind of guided discovery after a text and some controlled practice and something slightly freer. So I don't know really. I haven't really looked at one for a while, but I don't remember seeing anywhere anything. I mean, the term emergent language itself is often a bit kind of ambiguous because it was only really introduced with the whole dogma movement. So I've never seen it used in a course book per se, certainly not in a teacher's guide. I don't know about you, Danny.
No, not really. Or about sort of instruction that says if you were to ask this type of question, there will be more space for language to emerge, or this will take. So not the words. I think we'll get in teachers' guides things like this will take the lesson in a freer direction. This will give the students opportunities to offer opinions. But I think it doesn't quite. I don't know if I've ever seen the idea of what you then do with language that emerges from those freer things, freer moments. So yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
I think it is that kind of not fear necessarily, but maybe apprehension to kind of let the unknown happen. It's something that I'm trying to work into my writing now, and let teachers allow the unknown to happen and kind of embrace it. Now, talking of books, I don't know how I've managed to go 51 minutes without doing this. It's quite rude, I think, to be perfectly honest on my part. But books are great, and people who write books are also great. Now, both of you are those people. You've written a book, haven't you? Could you tell us what book you've written, and perhaps tell us maybe what it's about?
To introduce the book, then, can I just pick up on something that you said? And I think this is why we wrote the book, is that it's scary for teachers, especially newer teachers, very often, to deal with emergent language when it pops up for lots of reasons. It could be, I did some research with some teachers recently, and they were saying things like, well, do I have to be a walking dictionary? What if I don't know much about the topic? What if I don't know how to clarify the language? What if I look stupid in that moment? So I think there are lots of reasons why teachers find dealing with emergent language challenging. So the reason why we wrote the book is because we wanted to address some of these questions. Because we work on lots of training courses like CELTA, like Delta, MATESOL, and teachers do have concerns, quite valid concerns about improvising in the moment and working with what comes up and reacting to learning as it's emerging and exploiting. I think Peter used this term earlier on, learning opportunities within a lesson. So that's why we set out to write the book. You got anything to add on that, Danny?
Yeah, I think in a way we were looking at speeding up a process. We're often told that emergent language is for the pros, for the expert teachers or the experienced teachers, and I don't really know if that's the case. I think after a time teaching, you become more interactive. You get better at dealing with what's happening in front of you. But new teachers can do this. Novice teachers can do it. They just need the space to do so. So I think by becoming more aware early on in your career what emergent language is and how you might deal with it and why you might deal with it and how it can just be little moments. It doesn't have to be whole sort of dogma style lessons. You speed up the process of making teachers much more confident in doing so.
Now, I do have a question about more specifically about your book. Firstly, the most specific of all, what's the title of the book? And the next question, where and when can we get it?
Well, the book is called Working with Emergent Language. We've gone simple. So working with emergent languages, I can't remember the tagline, Rich. That's awful, isn't it? Ideas and activities for. Can you remember that second part?
Developing your reactive skills.
Thank you. Yes. But working with emergent language, available through Pavilion, and the end of January is the date we've been given, the latest date we've been given. So hopefully it will be out then, and you can buy it through the Pavilion website. You can pre-order copies through the Pavilion website, Pavilion ELT.
I'll put the link in the description at the end to let people know. And so it's working with emergent language, which which is what we've been talking about. Can you give us any hints as to what comes up in the book? Any secrets to delving inside?
I mean, a little idea about how the book's organised. The beginning of the book is kind of looking at what is emergent language, how do you work with it, how can teachers work with it, some of the theory behind it that backs up why it's important in the language learning process. So the first bit's kind of theory of what happens in the classroom, whereas the second bit is self-help book for teachers. So it's a big collection of, I think, 20 activities, isn't it, Danny? With 20 activities where that teachers can try out with themselves, with their colleagues. Trainers can use them on training courses. Managers can use them when they're helping their teachers with development, but you can certainly do it on your own as well. And what we've got for each of these activities, we've got case studies, a kind of case study really, a commentary of teachers who tried out some of these activities and what they found. So you can compare your experience with some other teachers on courses that we've worked on or in the staff rooms that we've talked to people from. So that's the little bit of the book. And then, go on, Danny,
Those teachers we've taken the case studies from, they range from people who are 2 weeks into their career. In fact, that they're in the second week of their CELTA course, to people with sort of 3, 4, 5, 6 years experience, and teachers work in different contexts. And the last part of the book is us interviewing experienced teachers in different contexts. So teachers who work with exam classes, teachers who work with younger learners and teens, teachers who work in challenging circumstances. And we ask them how they deal with emergent language in their contexts and kind of summarise the ideas, because we often ask, well, can I do it in exam classes? Can I do it in an English for academic purposes course? And the answer is yes, but we didn't know how, so we asked people who did. So the last part has a number of voices other than our own saying what they do in these contexts.
That is a fantastic point, actually. Now we're going to shoot off for about 2 minutes. If you can, I'm going to pose that question to you for when we come back in 2 minutes, and that is, if we're in one of these exam classes, so there's often the Cambridge First Certificate B2 exam class, or all of these different areas. I would like to ask a question about how we could deal with it, how we could deal with emergent language in those. So we'll be back in about 2 minutes. So I've given you a moment to think about that. And when we come back, we will share our ideas about that.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
This is Teachers Talk Radio.
And we are back. So, gentlemen, if you could unmute yourselves. I said 2 minutes, but it was actually much less than 2 minutes. So they may have popped off to fill their glass of water, and now they've been surprised that it wasn't actually 2 minutes. It was actually about 38 seconds. Richard, I see you're back.
Yes, I'm back. Do you want me to start talking?
Your question was about the question was about exam classes. This is an area where teachers are always pushed for time, and far too often teachers just only focus on the exam, and it's exam practice now, and this is the vocabulary that could come into the exam, so we're focused only on this. Not me, because I think that's boring.
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, before I became a CELTA trainer, so going back 12, 13 years, I always taught. The classes I liked the most were the exam classes, like FCE, those particular ones. CPE I always found a bit too hard for me, but CAE I did like a lot,
Agreed.
and I liked FCE. Oh, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, so for me, I think that there is an issue when we come to exam teaching. I think the problem is, it's the negative washback of only preparing them for the exam and just doing exam practice. And as we know, it only helps them so much. So I do think, if we think about language development, we've got to find parts of the lesson, certainly when you've got students at upper intermediate level, where they've got all of that language, they can do all the communication, but they're getting to limits in what they know. So I think lots of things you can do with some of the exam practice that might be useful. So for one example, you could use. Let's take two similar ones. You could take a bit of a text that you're looking at, and you could turn it into a dictogloss and see what emerges out of that. And is everyone familiar with a dictogloss? So it's a task.
Oh, look at that. Just as Rich was explaining what a dictogloss was, he cut out.
Oh, sorry.
Perfect timing there.
Yeah, so you could have a short bit of text from one of the readings that you're doing, and you read it out at a normal speed. The learners note down keywords they hear, and then they reconstruct the text. It could be from a text that they've done, you've looked at the day before in class for, let's say, I don't know, a use of English paper or something. So, then you see what emerges when they reconstruct the text. Another one I like is a grammaring, where you give them content words and they've got to add the grammar back to it. Also very useful for lots of the things that you have to do for FC and CAE. And they're very emergent activities, because you don't know. You're pushing the learners to the limit of what they can do. And obviously they're upper intermediate or advanced learners. If you push them to the edge of what they can do, then things are going to emerge that are new for them.
Oh, I like that idea.
The teacher we interviewed, about exams, a guy called Steve Ferreira, who works at International House London, he talked a lot about exam classes are very, very focused. So something like IELTS has always got kind of the environment or education or technology. So he says what you can do is give students these little discussion tasks around the topic, and work with the language that emerges, because that language could well be useful in future essays. But he also says that when you've got exams that include speaking and writing, assessment criteria is very often looking at things like lexical resources or lexical range or fluency. So he explores how he can get students to express ideas more effectively. So he says a lot does emerge in an exam class when you switch to the skills.
And I think it's a really good point Danny's made about the kind of language that you can deal with. Obviously those exams, they focus on lexicogrammar. So, by taking a piece of language and exploring how it works in a chunk of language, in a sentence, what other words go with it, then I think you're providing lots of exposure for the students as well.
I think one of the things that you guys have really brought to the fore for me within this, this phrase emergent language, it's that it is the whole of the language. Far too often as teachers we get stuck on emergent language being this, these individual words, these bits of vocabulary that pop up, and rather than chunks or phrases or prepositions that go with certain words. So it is the whole language that emerges, rather than just, today we talked about a spinny chair or an office chair, and that's what comes up on the board, an office chair, that's it. But it is more about, the whole language that goes around it.
Absolutely. I've just picked up what Steve wrote about exams, and he gives an example of a student answering in an exam paper that in his country there's a lot of small crimes. And so what he did is he started putting other words on the board like petty crime and misdemeanor, and taught a load of new words, and then said to the students, now rewrite your essays. So they're getting the exam practice with the lexical resource thrown in. It's the whole language. Yes, it's saying what you want to say in other ways.
And it doesn't always have to be the teacher reformulating the learners.
Yeah.
It can actually be the learners reformulating their own work, certainly with something like writing, like that. And I like activities that encourage the learners to reformulate their own work. But, as soon as the learners get to the edge of what they know, that's when we can provide them with some input. And then they can augment their own choices with it afterwards. It's a bit like, when you do a task, teach, task lesson. To do a task, give them some input on language, and then get them to redo the same task again. But this time, hopefully, enriching it with some of the language feedback that they've received.
We've just got another comment here from Pete saying it's interesting. I've always thought of Dictogloss as not emergent, only because you as the teacher can anticipate unknown vocab based on your knowledge of the learners. So I think in that sense, it realigns my thinking on what is emergent. It's not 100% something we can't predict, basically.
I think we can predict it, and that's one of the things that we suggest in the book. So let's say you're doing a task with learners, you might, agreeing and disagreeing. There's probably a stock load of phrases that you've taught to intermediate classes before that you might want to teach the students. The difference with emergent language, you don't set out to teach those forms.
Mm-hmm.
There's a gap, and then what's necessary for them to maybe complete a task or do something, that's when you feed the language in. So, as Danny said before at the beginning of this session, there's a slight grey area between where it moves. But certainly as teachers, with experience of the classroom, we definitely do, naturally predict what might come up.
I saw this very interesting sort of dictogloss, sort of dictation activity recently where a teacher did a live listening where they were talking about habits. So the plan was teaching present simple. That
You've just muted yourself, Danny.
Am I back? Am I back? Yeah.
Back. You are.
My dad's memory. I might have to phone him up and sort this out. Yeah, he's phoned me twice now under strict instructions not to. Yeah, so I'm doing a sort of dictation dictogloss where the aim of the lesson was eventually to present simple habits, likes and dislikes. But the teacher talked about that he was good at cooking chili con carne. So he said, I often cook chili con carne. In the breakout room, the students decided that this was chili en conch. He cooked chili en conch, which was one of my favourite bits of emergent language of the year so far. But they thought en conch isn't a word, so they decided it was chili Hong Kong. So it must be a kind of a Cantonese dish, and the teacher had to sort of that's what they ended up dealing with for about 5 minutes, chili con carne. Dealing with the mishearing that was completely unpredictable. So yeah, it has target language, has a dictogloss, but something completely. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think a dictogloss definitely can be forms focused if you're teaching the past simple, as Danny says. So I was being videoed teaching class I didn't really know, an intermediate class a couple of years ago. We were doing a project at IH. I did a kind of dictogloss, so a text reconstruct activity, and my was on I think perfect forms. However, the students didn't have a problem with the grammar; they found that quite easy, really. So it's quite underwhelming to them. But what they did find interesting in the dictogloss were things like phrasal verbs that popped up that emerge around the topics that we might have selected to teach as well. And there can be room for both target language and emergent language in the class.
Exactly, yeah. So that idea, I heard a laugh when phrasal verbs came up there. Was that a deliberate laugh in the background there, Danny, of phrasal verbs? Is that something that...
No, I was laughing at Peter's sounds like a meaty focus.
Oh, okay, you were laughing at the great pun. I thought it was a laugh at phrasal verbs.
No.
Because I imagine when it comes to teaching emergent language, even as a teacher, when we are up there at the front and teaching our classes, there are times when we use an awful lot of phrasal verbs, and perhaps that's the kind of thing that can really stump students in a lesson, that maybe we we use some kind of language that they don't know. So it emerges from us as teachers, not as much from the students.
I think, with teachers, we notice where there are gaps in the knowledge of our learners. And again, knowing our learners, we might feed things in that we think is useful for them developmentally at that moment when we notice it. So I think it is bidirectional. It's not only from communication breakdowns with the learner. It's actually, if I've got, an advanced class, which I was often given at IH, they can all communicate pretty well. What am I going to teach them? So actually what I find doing is looking, again, as I think I mentioned before, looking for what they don't know, really, or what I can give them to extend what they can already do. And that's very much working, as it comes up. I don't think I can predict that very often.
Yeah, it's giving them options as well. Very often the phrasal verb is the sort of perhaps the more common way of saying something, where they might use sort of quite formalized language, or quite commonly especially Spanish, Italian speakers are kind of using a verb that's the same in their language that you might not use in English. I can't think of an example now, but so the phrasal verb is probably more common, or the teachers suspect it's more common. I think that's one thing we have to remember as well. We're very often intuiting what we think is the most useful sort of vocabulary item to give them.
Castigate could be one. Castigar is to tell somebody off. So there's an example.
Yeah. So you might say to a student, I'm not sure many people use that word. I think we're more like, I might say tell off instead, or something like that. Yeah. But you're not really making the judgment. You're kind of, well, you are making the judgment, I suppose, but you're kind of guessing the most common word.
Excellent. Now, I'd like to know, I often ask students, we're talking so much about students on this. I often ask guests, as you are guests here, not students. I ask for lists. Now, I often ask for a top 3 of something. Now, I'm not going to ask you for your top 3 list of activities to do when using emergent language, because I'm guessing, as it's emergent language, it depends very much on the situation. So choosing your top 3 is probably important. But could you each come up with one that you would suggest using, suggest with people who are coming into, trying to approach the emergent language? Is there one kind of go-to activity that they can jump on to kind of get their ball rolling?
If people wanted to experiment with emergent language, there's one I love, and it's one I learned from Nick Bilber, who runs the Hands Up project. And it's a really simple activity where you show the learners a picture of 2 people talking. And I've got a 2 kids sitting on a railway line looking quite serious. And then I just get them to say, who are these people? Where are they? What are they talking about? And write their dialogue. So as soon as the learners start producing language that's meaning focused, because it's focused on the context, then they get to bits where they start saying, teacher, how do I say? Or when they come to reading their dialogues back, there are lots of points that then the teacher can reformulate and provide input for the learners in that way. That's one activity I use, and it's never failed in about nearly 20 years of teaching. So that's one I recommend. How about for you, Danny?
I think I'm gonna say images again, because I think to get yourself started, using images is such a great idea. I have these photos I've drawn. So I took this activity from something in ELT, the ELT journal years ago, and I cannot remember who wrote it, but it's a brilliant activity. You draw photographs of events. You tell a story, and the students ask you questions. Then they draw their own memorable event and prepare to tell the rest of the class. What it enables you to do is monitor as they draw, asking questions like, "Oh, what are you drawing? So what happened?" They then tell you things, and you can upgrade or reformulate the language as you're monitoring, so that when they share their stories, they're using some of the emergent language, and more languages go to emerge through storytelling. Something about memory-related activities, I think, are really great for emergent language, because they very often haven't told those stories before in a second language. So, they're long, they're extended terms. Students are very invested in them, so they're quite rich in language. They're utterly unpredictable.
I think
Totally
so.
agree with
So,
stories.
sorry, Richard,
Sorry.
I interrupted you there.
No. I was going to say, I totally agree with stories. I think stories are just such a great way because they're real, or even if they're imagined, there's that meaning focus I was talking about before.
I think that was the kind of the what I've been getting in general from everything is that kind of meaning side of things and that connection with it when it comes to emergent language, because it is that desire to be able to communicate an idea, and as you say, when it comes from a memory or from a picture that they've had or they've taken, it's often going to be something that our students are desperate to use and are desperate to learn. So that's why the language often emerges. Now, I've often found in my classes that, again, going back to exam classes, something that are perhaps a necessary evil in an ELT teacher's environment. I really enjoy them because of that communication level. But the thing I always found where a whole lot of the emergent language came out was in the most contrived of all the situations, and that is the speaking exam. For example, in the FCE exam, where they do that thing that you always do down the pub with your mates, and they compare two photographs.
Yes,
It's totally natural. I know why
I was
we
just
teach
doing
those
that
things.
last
We always do
night.
that down the pub. So yeah, exactly. Doing it the other day, weren't we? Comparing and contrasting pictures.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
found that with that was where the most emergent language would come out. So I don't know if it's if it's a common thing that when there is that kind of visual stimulus, that is often something that encourages it, or if that's just my own personal experience.
I think it's something about the sort of unpredictability of it, because you've got students from all over the world looking at a picture. They're going to interpret it in different ways. They're going to have different reactions to it. So, and I suppose we do sort of share pictures all the time. We just do it in a different way. So I think it is just something that sets something off in the brain. When you're sitting on the bus, you do see people just scrolling through pictures. It'd be interesting to know what they're thinking.
I think it activates your world knowledge, doesn't it? When you see an image, all that experience that you've got stored up, life experience, and it gets a talking point then, and a reason to communicate. I think in the classroom anyway. We might not do it down the pub, but it certainly gets people talking.
Yeah.
Another thing I've found really has helped, particularly again, now I'm looking more here at, again, teens and adult learners, is when everybody gets into a TV show. So I remember when Game of Thrones was on, I was teaching secondary school kids, and after the show every week we'd come in and everyone would talk about it, and there would be so much language that came out of this because it's it wasn't from the textbook necessarily. It's because it came from real life, and it's because it was something they wanted to talk about. Is that something teachers could perhaps use to harness emergent language?
Definitely, and I mean, I think if you were to look up the word language in a dictionary, let's take the Oxford English Dictionary, like a system for communicating thoughts and feelings about the world. So I think that's what we need to do, is to emulate that meaning of language in the classroom. So something like that is a perfect opportunity for that.
Absolutely, I think
that disappointment at the ending of Game of Thrones.
Yes,
Sorry, Danny, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I think it's any kind of shared knowledge. So at the moment, you'll come into class, and the last few weeks, I've come into class, and there are 3 students because of bus strikes, and I'll say, well, everyone, did you guys get in okay? What was it like? We're spending a lot of time describing our journeys into work, and a student will say things like, I went to the station and the workers are outside and they're waving paper. They're like, oh, that's a picket line. And so there's a lot that, I think my students are very well versed with kind of strike knowledge now, strike lexis, because it's our shared world at the moment. But when you get a shared TV show, that can be absolutely fantastic. because it's all you want to talk about. I tried to get them to watch this show called The Traitors recently, but none of them did. It was a real shame, because I think that would have been great to talk about.
That it is great when you can kind of all get onto something. Now, again, with teenagers, it's difficult with something like Game of Thrones, which another wonderful pun from Pete Punner there saying
Yes.
no spoilers, please.
I'm
Beginning
beginning to understand the name.
So yeah, it's tricky sometimes to find that kind of common area, because you don't want your teens to necessarily advise them to go and watch Game of Thrones. So I don't know, other areas of what Laura's mentioned, water cooler moments, great things to bring in. So the World Cup happened recently, for right or for wrong, but obviously for wrong, or whatever your opinion may be. But the World Cup happened after much corruption and wrongness. But that was a huge topic of conversation. And I don't think I've had in my life so much emergent language come out of an event than that. And no, it was this World Cup where I've had the most emergent language come out, I think.
Yeah, I had two instances today because we were talking about traditional dress, and Saudi students were talking about thobes, and another student said, "Oh, is that what they put on Messi at the end of the World Cup?" And I can't remember the name now, but a student said that's not a thobe; it's a Qatari word for the same sort of outfit. And then another student, but it covered the picture of Argentina on his top. And then, oh, you mean the emblem, the badge? So even today we were emergent World Cup related emergent language, because it's so fresh in their minds.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Laura's made a point that is a very good point. And as the host, I feel terrible that I haven't brought this point up with 8 minutes remaining in the show. But she said, I missed the beginning, so apologies if this was covered. It wasn't. Learners have to trust their teachers will respect and value their contributions when it comes to emergent language. How do you feel about, well, Richard said, yes, good point. But yeah, how can we kind of build that trust and respect?
I think, really listening to your students is the first thing, listening to what they're saying rather than listening to the mistakes that they're making. I think really listening to the content of what they're saying is absolutely key. So in that way you're treating them like real people rather than just people that you're going to correct. I think that's the first stage to creating that atmosphere, and if you're really interested in what people have got to say and you're curious about what your students actually think, and you treat that seriously, I think you do build a lot of rapport in the classroom in that way.
I think also it's really important that they see you thinking about emergent language. So when a student's trying to say something at kind of the limit of their capabilities, and they're kind of struggling, but so are you sometimes as a teacher. So you might kind of say, "Oh, well, I think you're trying to. Oh, what would be a good word here?" You kind of negotiate together. You kind of co-create what the student is trying to say. And so those little moments where you sit back and go, okay, good question. What would be a good word? And they can see you thinking about what they want. I think it's quite nice. Whereas I think when we're too quick to react because we know the answer already, students probably feel a little bit like they're in a routine. But when they can see you really thinking, okay, how can I help this person? I think that really builds trust.
I agree.
I think for me, like when it comes to emergent language, now Richard touched on it a little bit earlier when he was talking about the different exam classes, and he mentioned proficiency classes. Now, I remember my first ever proficiency class, and I was terrified, mostly because in the textbook, there was an entire unit on the subjunctive in English, and I was just like, why on earth would I teach somebody this? Whereas, what it basically were 5 or 6 chunks of language that might emerge, and somebody's shoehorned it into a textbook. But I remember the amount of emergent language that came out in there, and I think one of the key trust building moments in that was the I don't know moment from me as a teacher. Yes, I am proficient in English. Yes, I'm quite good at speaking English, and I can mark according to a mark scheme, but I don't actually know. So let's find out together.
I think that's really important. I find that a lot. It does come with confidence, though. I think that in your teaching, that where you say, "I don't know," and it's like, go, well, let's have a look at what preposition goes with that verb. Let's Google it together and find the most, what common ones come up. I think that's a really nice thing to do together, and I also think it's good learner training because you show them how to do it themselves as well.
Yeah, I think that was like such a pivotal moment in my teaching career, and it had taken until I was teaching those levels to be able to admit, hey, do you know what? Maybe I don't know, and that's happened an awful lot since then. When I've admitted that maybe I don't know this, and I'm not the perfect person who knows absolutely everything, the font of all knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to building trust, building respect within your class, letting them know that maybe you're not perfect, but you can work on it together is super important.
My students taught me a word the other day, or going goblin.
Yeah.
They said they'd spent. Do you know the word? Have you heard it?
Well, with Goblin Mode, it was the Oxford
Goblin
Word
mode.
of the
Yes,
Year,
yeah,
I think.
that's right. Yeah, so they'd read it before I had, and so if you kind of have this curious, you encouraging sort of curiosity in your learners, they go off looking for things, and they come in and say, "Oh, I saw this sign, and I read this," and I'd seen Goblin mode, but I'd never heard going goblin. Oh no, he's gone goblin.
Oh
And I thought,
wow,
oh,
yeah.
that it was nice. I liked it a little bit more than the Goblin mode one.
It is one of the beautiful things about the way language is, and particularly the way it is at the moment with the internet and the way language evolves, and there are so many new words that are coming out there that are literally emerging not only in the classroom, but it does kind of give particularly our younger students that opportunity to be the teacher to the teacher, because the teacher might not have heard about a certain phrase or something, and it does give them the opportunity to stand up there and say, so going goblin is when end up just,
but it's also sort of Englishes that come from their languages. So a Japanese guy told me today that when in English you say there's plenty more fish in the sea, they would say that there are more stars in the. Don't worry, there are more stars in the sky. And he said, "Could you say that?" And I said, "Well, you should be able to say that because it's much nicer."
it is, isn't it?
Yeah. Though then another student said, "Yes, but it's hard to catch a star." So it kind of allows other Englishes, all the Englishes can come out. It doesn't have to be from one place, one expert type thing.
I prefer the stars in the sky because we can't overfish that.
Yes.
Plenty more fish in the sea for now.
For now, yes,
but there won't be soon. Maybe if you go to a fish farm, and then they'll just be covered in disease. Anyway, let's we'll leave Seaspiracy out of this one for now. Gentlemen, this has been wonderful. There was a wonderful technical hitch halfway through there. You did brilliantly. As I say, a future in radio hosting for you two is certainly on the cards. So I'd like to say thank you again. I'd like to encourage everybody to follow both of these lovely gentlemen. So where can they follow you? Richard, would you like to go first?
Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn or on Facebook. A bit slightly harder to find on Facebook, but certainly follow me on LinkedIn. It'd be lovely to hear what you do in your classes and to let you know if you have a look at our book, do let us know what you think of it.
For me, you can get access to some sort of talks and slides on my WordPress site, which is just my name, Danny Norrington Davis. WordPress. That's it. LinkedIn as well. You could try and find me on Facebook, but I don't think I've posted anything for about 8 months, so you might be wasting your time with that one. But LinkedIn, I'm a lot more active.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll put the link to
really
your
enjoyed
WordPress
it.
in the in the description box. I am on it in this exact moment right now, so I will
fantastic.
share that on there for any listeners to to jump in and have
Lovely,
a listen.
thank you.
And
Thanks,
don't forget,
Harry.
the book is coming out soon, at
Next
the end
couple
of
of weeks, yeah.
January.
I've just had an email today saying the end of January, so fingers crossed for them. We've been waiting a little while, but thanks so much for having us on the show. It's been really great talking to you.
Yeah, loved it. Thank you.
Brilliant. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you, everybody, for listening and for your contributions. I will hear you again next week. Thank you very much, everybody. I'll see you later.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.